It's a wonderful evening to you, Zimbabweans, as we celebrate the removal of the executive order sanctions upon Zimbabwe. And this is a celebration that we're taking to the whole of SADC, which has stood behind Zimbabwe, to the South African government that has stood with Zimbabwe, and to all Africans. We're absolutely ecstatic. And many of you have seen this face, you've seen this uniform. Some of you were probably not even listening to me because you saw a madman who's always talking about sanctions. We are the civil activists who had to fight against the sanctions, create knowledge and awareness in the region, create knowledge and awareness about the need for us to fight these sanctions through protests, through legal action, and through taking this issue into the multilateral space. We're the first group of people that actually applied on the UN website to invite the UN to come through to Zimbabwe to measure the negative impact of these sanctions, to prove that we were under sanctions. We were also the first group of people, the first civil society organization to go to court in South Africa, the biggest trading partner of Zimbabwe, to sue the banks in that country, or at least to ask for a declaratory order that banks and institutions or third parties in South Africa should not be implementing illegal sanctions without trying those people that are under sanctions that they're going to implement sanctions on and deprive services or human rights. And we have to say it has been very successful. Before we even got here, just last week, Advocate Simbachitando, together with attorney Leslie Ramulife, had actually put in answering papers to the papers of the banks and Joe Biden. Joe Biden actually responded to our papers in the South African court, and he was saying that he's going to demand immunity from DIRCO of South Africa. And in our papers, we informed him that we were going to challenge his application for immunity in South Africa because he was using this immunity to continue to institute sanctions that demand and ask South African institutions, banks, and companies to illegally implement sanctions against South African law, against international law, and against human rights. And so those answering papers were handed in last week, and then our lawyers were going to sit with the banking lawyers and Biden's lawyers to then speak to the head of the Gauteng district so that they can determine when we were going to go to court. And that was done last week, and this week, Joe Biden removes the sanctions. And I have to say to people who are saying that, well, the sanctions have been removed, but Zidera remains, so that means nothing has happened. There's nothing that could be further from the truth. The removal of 3 executive order sanctions is tantamount to the removal of 93% of the sanctions that were on Zimbabwe and 100% of sanctions that were on the government of Zimbabwe, 100% of sanctions that were on the civilians of Zimbabwe. This is very important. Remember this. Zidera was imposed in 2001 to deprive the Zimbabwean government the ability to get loans from multilateral lending institutions and cancellation of those loans from multilateral lending institutions. This would be achieved by the directors of the United States sitting on the boards of these multilateral lending institutions, not voting for Zimbabwe to get loans and not voting for Zimbabwe to get debt cancellation. But those sanctions were never adequate. This is why Robert Mugabe was able to be re-elected as president in 2002 after a year of those sanctions. And so George Bush decided that he needed the sanctions to bite some more. Hence, he introduced what was called the national emergency that he declared on Zimbabwe as a threat to U.S. national security interests. After that declaration, he imposed 3 sets of sanctions. And those set of sanctions were imposed because they realized that sanctions on the government of Zimbabwe denying it loans were not good enough. They had to cripple the parastatals. They had to cripple industry. They had to cripple investment. They had to cripple the banks, the mines, agriculture, and they had to cripple the government's ability to give services to its people. And they wanted that collective punishment of the Zimbabwean people to force the Zimbabwean people to uprise and remove their government. So that's why we say that those executive order sanctions which are instituted to really punish the Zimbabwean people were 93% of the sanctions, and they were 100% of the sanctions on civilians and the government. Those have been removed now. The Zimbabwean government can go and borrow money. Zimbabwean businesses can borrow money. They can buy machines. They can get payment clearances. The corresponding banking relationships, 108 of them that ran away, US dollar corresponding relationships that ran away, will be coming back. But we have to say, and it's important for us to say, that it is only after ZASA decided to take this fight into the multilateral space, going to the UN, lobbying our government to also call the UN, us applying on the UN website for crimes against humanity being done upon Zimbabweans, that we saw the UN come to Zimbabwe for the first time in 21 years and pronouncing that the sanctions on Zimbabwe were violating human rights and were a crime against humanity. Soon after that, we got a statement from the UN Human Rights Rapporteur saying that there was a violation of human rights being done by the sanctions. She also pronounced that it is illegal for there to be implementation of illegal sanctions, and therefore it gave us the ammunition to go to South African courts, our biggest trading partner, and to ask those courts to make a declaratory order against the banks that are instituting these sanctions to stop instituting these sanctions. And within that, for the first time in history, Joe Biden, a US president, responded to papers in an African court, and he wanted to be given immunity, and we were going to challenge it in the same way that AfriForum challenged Grace Mugabe's immunity. And so this is how we lead to be where we are now, where these papers pressured last year for the US government, ABSA, which was one of the banks that we cited, and a Standard Bank, to give loans to the government of Zimbabwe to the tune of 292 million for the government of Zimbabwe to build hospitals and clinics. And OFAC, US Treasury OFAC, which institutes sanctions, signed off and allowed those loans to be given. Another loan was given by the EU for 120 million to refurbish the Kariba Dam. Again, OFAC did not penalize the Europeans for giving us those loans. And 11 corresponding banking relationships came all between the time that we launched our case in February 2022 and to date. And then now, last week, Simba Chitando and Leslie Ramulife answered to the papers of Joe Biden and the banks. And then a week later, Joe Biden removes sanctions. We are happy. Absolutely happy, and we acknowledge that other players in the background in other areas played a role, but we cannot take away the fact that the fight against Zimbabwean sanctions began in earnest when we became a public figure and civil society organization fighting these sanctions publicly with an effective strategy of going to court and taking this to multilateral institutions. Another thing is the biggest change began to happen when we had a discussion with a wonderful lady who works for Congress. She's a Congress advisor from a legal perspective, counterterrorism perspective. And we told her that we were going to persuade our government to go to the International Court of Justice because the United States was imposing sanctions on civilians and collectively punishing civilians. And that was illegal and a crime against humanity. And they were not measuring the impact of their sanctions, and they were not remedying that. For the first time in history, we saw the United States Congress Subcommittee on Human Rights, Health, and organization coming and doing an impact assessment of the sanctions in Zimbabwe. That was the beginning of the end of these sanctions in 2021. And today we're sitting here, 2024, and these sanctions have been successfully removed. The most pertinent, most evil of these sanctions are removed. Now, what are we going to do about the 10 sanctions on the president, a number of business people, and some ministers? Those individual sanctions through the Magnitsky Act, it's being called the Global Magnitsky Act, but it's still illegal sanctions imposed based on allegations without giving the people that are being sanctioned an opportunity to answer for themselves and an opportunity to be heard, and it is punishment without trial. So again, we will say and urge the president of the country, plus the businessmen there, that join us, and we will undertake legal action to get these sanctions, absurd sanctions, removed. You've proved that legal pressure works, and it has worked better than re-engagement, because if re-engagement had worked, the president wouldn't be under sanctions, our vice president would be under sanctions, and members of our government wouldn't be under sanctions. So the truth of the matter is civil activism, legal action has been more effective. And don't let anybody lie to you and say to you that nothing has changed. Everything has changed. Zimbabwe has a chance to prosper again. Investment will come back into Zimbabwe. Money can move freely from Zimbabwe to other countries. We can order machines, we can order tools, we can order technology, we can order inputs, we can order fertilizers, we can order anything we want. What you Zimbabweans need to be careful about is losing your economy to the capital that is going to fly into your country. And please take advantage of the opportunities in your country. Don't let the Chinese, Americans, British, and Europeans come and take your supper. Wake up. And I want to say to you, good night. We will always be at your service. Zimbabwe Anti-Sanctions Movement, Peace.